Your grandfather bought his first house at 26 on a single income, working a job that didn't require a college degree. No family money, no two-earner household, just a normal job and a normal paycheck. If you brought that same story to someone your age today, they'd assume you were exaggerating, or lying, or leaving something out. And every time this comes up online, the conversation splits into two camps almost instantly. One side says, older generations just worked harder and saved better. The other side says the whole system is rigged and there's nothing you can do. Both of those explanations are wrong, and worse, they're both useless, because neither one tells you what actually changed or what you can actually do about it. So let's actually look at what happened, with real numbers, because the real story is stranger, more specific, and honestly more useful than either side of that argument. Here's the number that matters most. And it's not the price of a house. It's the price of a house relative to what people earned. Back in the early 1970s, the typical home cost roughly 2 to 3 times the typical household's yearly income. Today, in most major metro areas, that ratio has climbed to somewhere between 6 and 8 times yearly income. And in the most expensive cities, it's higher still. That's not a subtle shift. That's the difference between saving up a reasonable chunk of 1 year's pay for a down payment and needing to save what feels like a second mortgage's worth of cash just to get in the door. Now, the easy explanation is that houses just got fancier, bigger, nicer, and there's a little truth to that. The average new home built today is meaningfully larger than the average new home built 50 years ago. But that alone doesn't come close to explaining a jump like this, because existing older homes, the exact same square footage, the exact same 3-bedroom ranch house that existed in 1975, cost dramatically more relative to income today than it did back then too. The house didn't get better enough to justify the gap. Something else moved. So what actually moved? Let's go through it, because there isn't one villain here. There are 4 separate forces that all happen to stack on top of each other at the same time. The first one is supply, and this is the one almost nobody explains clearly. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating hard through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, local zoning laws across the country got dramatically more restrictive. Minimum lot sizes grew. Height limits shrank. Multifamily housing, the duplexes and small apartment buildings that used to be legal to build almost everywhere, became illegal to build in huge portions of most cities. This wasn't one law, it was thousands of small local decisions made over decades, and the cumulative effect was straightforward. Population kept growing. The legal ability to build enough housing to match that growth did not. When demand keeps rising and supply is legally capped, price does the only thing it can do. The second force is interest rates, and this one's almost the opposite of what people assume. Mortgage rates in the early 1980s actually peaked above 18%, genuinely brutal by any standard. But through the 2000s and 2010s, rates fell to some of the lowest levels in modern history, at times dipping below 3%. Low rates sound like good news for buyers, and in one sense they are. Your monthly payment on the same loan amount is smaller. But here's the twist nobody mentions. When borrowing gets cheaper, buyers can afford to bid more for the same house. And in a market where supply is already restricted, cheap money doesn't make housing more affordable. It gets bid straight into the price. Low rates didn't lower the cost of buying a home, they mostly just let sellers charge more for it. The third force is wages, and this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. From the 1940s through the early 70s, worker productivity and worker pay rose together, roughly in lockstep. Since then, productivity has kept climbing, but typical wages have grown much more slowly, especially once you adjust for inflation. Workers have been producing more value for decades without seeing that value show up proportionally in their paychecks. Meanwhile, housing costs kept climbing at their own pace, largely disconnected from wage growth. You had one line going up steadily and a second line going up much faster, and the space between those two lines is a huge part of the gap your grandparents never had to cross. And the fourth force is the one people feel the most and understand the least. The definition of a normal household changed. In your grandparents' era, a single income buying a house wasn't unusual, it was the default. Today, most home purchases in the country involve two full incomes, not because people got lazier or less capable, but because the math simply requires it in most places now. That shift quietly reset the baseline. When two incomes became the norm for qualifying for a mortgage, home prices adjusted upward to match what two-income households could collectively afford, which made a single income, even a good one, feel dramatically less sufficient than it used to. Stack all four of these together: restricted supply, cheap borrowing that got absorbed into price, wages that decoupled from productivity, and a shift from one income to two as the buying standard, and you get exactly the world we're living in now. Not a mystery, not laziness, not entitlement, a specific, traceable set of structural shifts that happened gradually enough that no single year ever felt dramatic, but that added up to something completely different from what existed 2 generations ago. Here's why this actually matters beyond just understanding the history. If you've spent years quietly blaming yourself, wondering what you're doing wrong compared to your parents or grandparents, the honest answer is probably nothing. You're not failing at a game that used to be easier. You're playing an entirely different game with different rules, and most of those rule changes happened before you were even old enough to have a say in any of it. That doesn't mean there's nothing you can do, though, and this is where it gets practical instead of just discouraging. A few things follow directly from understanding these 4 forces. Because supply restrictions vary enormously by city, geographic flexibility is worth more today than it's ever been. Some metro areas have kept building, and the math there looks completely different from the most restricted coastal markets. Because two incomes have become the practical norm, planning around a household's combined earning power, rather than benchmarking against a single income era that no longer exists, is simply realistic, not a compromise. And because wages have decoupled from productivity broadly, but not in every single field or company, the specific career and negotiation choices you make now carry more weight than they used to, precisely because the general wage escalator isn't doing as much of the work for you automatically. None of this makes the math easy. I'm not going to stand here and tell you a home is definitely within easy reach if you just try hard enough, because for a lot of people in a lot of cities right now, that would be dishonest. But understanding exactly which forces built the gap you're facing is worth something real. It turns a vague, demoralizing feeling of being behind into a specific set of facts you can actually plan around. Your grandparents weren't smarter than you, and you're not behind because of some personal failure. You're standing on the other side of 4 decades of structural change that nobody voted on directly and almost nobody explained clearly. Now you know what actually happened. What you do with that is up to you. If you found this helpful, subscribe to Bola Invests and turn on notifications for more investing content.